Welcome back to World History. Today we're going to expand the Renaissance northward and look at what happens when all of the new things that were happening in Italy start to move to different places and start to touch on not just artistic and social pieces, but also start to change religion. I'll give you a hint. It's not going to be pretty. Ugh. Okay, so by the end of this lesson, your three goals. One, analyze how the things that were happening in Northern Europe were somewhat different from what was happening in Italy. Explain the effect of the printing press, which, kind of a big deal. And look at the key teachings of a guy named Martin Luther, who also kind of a big deal. So, the Renaissance is going to spread northward through trade routes, the same way it spread into Italy, because, of course, northern European states were also recovering from the Black Death, and so we saw some of the same things happening there that were happening on the Italian peninsula. But because of cultural differences, northern Renaissance artists are going to focus on more everyday things. The most famous example of this is this piece of work called The Peasants Wedding, which focuses on the everyday life of the common people, as opposed to the Italian Renaissance, which tended to focus mostly on the upper class. So we see a new focus here on more everyday life as opposed to elite life in Northern Europe. The other massive game changer is the printing press, which is an incredibly sort of complicated invention that uses a couple different things. We see one, this movable type that can be moved about in order to print a variety of different things. You then put ink on there, and then you can print the same message on multiple pieces of paper. And this was first combined together in its modern form by a guy named Johann Gutenberg. And he used it to print, unsurprisingly, the Bible, because, of course, you print what people want, and what people wanted at this time was, more access to the Bible. The printing press caught on, and you can clearly see, moving from, in the span of like 40 years, we just slightly increased the amount of printing presses in Europe. But it's difficult to overstate just how big of a deal this was. The idea that before this, books had to be copied painstakingly by hand. And so there were the average person had pretty much no access to books. The only book that they might see in their whole entire life was a copy of the Bible. And now with the printing press, people can print pamphlets, they can print books. Like, the amount of books in Europe just exploded. And so if there's more books, there's more motivation for more people to learn how to read and how to write. And so the obvious effect is literacy rates are going to increase significantly. And so the printing press led to a massive explosion of information in Europe. It should also be noted that in order for the printing press to be useful, paper also had to come to Europe, which, as you can see, came to Europe incredibly late. So up until about 1400, most of Europe didn't have access to paper, which was actually an ancient Chinese invention. And we would have talked about this if we had more time to talk about China. But it spread across the world over the span of about 2,000 years or 1,500 years, and finally came to Europe. And the importance of paper is, of course, it's very easy and cheap to produce. So rather than having to write everything on clay tablets or on dried animal skins, now you can just chop down and pulp up trees and create what we know today as paper, which is incredibly important for sharing information. So that brings us back to the Catholic Church. We haven't really talked in depth about the Catholic Church, but it's important to know a couple things about it. This was the main religion in Europe. Everyone, or almost everyone in Europe, was Catholic. The vast majority of the population. Catholicism is a very, what we call a hierarchical religion, where there's the Pope on top who makes all the decisions and is infallible. Then he gives directions to his lieutenants, the cardinals, who give directions to the archbishops, who give directions to the bishops, who give directions to the priests. It's actually structured after the way that the Romans used to structure their government. But of course, even after Rome fell, the church continued to exist. The church governed over every part of a person's life through what are called the sacraments. So, for example, you're going to get married, priest's got to be there. You're going to get your sins forgiven, priest's got to be there. You're going to come of age, priest has to be there. You're born, priest is there. You die, priest is there. So the priests of the Catholic Church were totally involved in the people's lives. And the Pope had massive amounts of power, so if anyone did anything sort of against the church, he could issue what's called a papal bull, or basically a document that could potentially, kick you out of the church, what's called excommunication, or it could prevent any of the sacraments from being given to you, basically meaning that you can't have any of these central life experiences that were so important to the people of this time. Plus, of course, the church controlled the fate of your eternal soul, which, is somewhat important to, some people. One of the more controversial things that emerged in the sort of late Middle Ages was the rise of something called indulgences, which we're going to get to in just one moment. So, indulgences. Catholic teachings held that a person's soul, the fate of a person's soul, whether it would go to heaven or hell, was tied to two things. One, their belief in God, and two, their actions throughout their life or their good deeds. So, a combination of your faith and your works, the things that you've done, determine whether you go to heaven or not. But indulgences provide kind of a go-between or an insurance, in that you could buy forgiveness for some of your actions from a priest, and then you'd get this fancy document, as pictured here, which has the papal seal on it, which would then basically nullify those deeds that you'd done that were bad. So by paying money, you could eliminate the part of the works part of salvation and just go to heaven based on your faith, and then, of course, the money you paid the Catholic Church. This was problematic for, of course, people who couldn't pay, especially poor peasants, but it was a big moneymaker for the church, and so the practice started to grow and become widespread, specifically by this guy Johannes Tetzel, who issued thousands of indulgences. Martin Luther was a Catholic monk who had some concerns about the Catholic Church. More or less, Martin Luther was terrified that he was going to hell. And he thought that he could never live a good enough life to live up to all the church standards and make sure that his soul was secure he was secure in his knowledge that his soul was going to heaven. And so, Martin Luther looked at this practice of selling indulgences and said, this also is really unsatisfying. And so Martin Luther got together and wrote down all his grievances, what are known as the 95 Theses, and he posted them on the bulletin board of the day, or the front page of the website of the day, the front of the chapel door. He laid out all of these things, and in these criticisms, he started to develop three basic philosophies. The first is called Solafide, or by faith alone. This is the idea that the only thing that is responsible, you are individually responsible for your own salvation through your own faith and your relationship with God. The church doesn't give you salvation, indulgences don't give you salvation, you having a relationship with God gives you salvation. He also argued that all members of the church should be able to read and interpret the Bible for themselves because, of course, they needed to have a relationship with God in order to determine their own salvation. And in order to be able to interpret all of these things, he argued that it was the Bible alone which contained Holy Scripture, and that the Catholic Church coming up with all this nonsense like indulgences just wasn't cutting it. We need to go back to the Bible. Everyone needs to read it and understand it so they can have this relationship with God and be saved. These were the basic teachings of Martin Luther, and the Catholic Church was, in a word, less than thrilled. So, as we mentioned, the Catholic Church was less than thrilled by Martin Luther basically saying that they didn't have any authority to do anything, and it was the people who should have a relationship with God. So the Pope sent a letter to Martin Luther, a papal bull, threatening him with excommunication. They were going to kick him out of the church and damn his soul to hell if he didn't recant his teachings. Luther, in an amazing show of defiance, famously burned the Pope's notice. Here we can see him setting fire to the Pope's notice in defiance of the Pope. And so Luther was then an outlaw, and they had this trial called the Diet of Worms, where the political leader of Germany, or the German states that would eventually make up Germany when we get to that next semester, called Luther in front of him to have a trial in order to figure out who was right. Luther stood up again defiantly at this trial and dared the Catholic Church to find anything in his teachings that was illegitimate. And in the end, the Holy Roman Emperor did not arrest and send Luther back to Rome. And so he continued teaching, he continued preaching, And he continued translating the Old Testament into German, which of course is incredibly important if the average person, because up to this point, the Bible had been written exclusively in Latin, which the average person did not speak. So if the average person was going to read, interpret the Bible, and then have a relationship with God, they probably needed to be able to read it. And so Luther started translating it into German, which again, the church was not thrilled about. Unsurprisingly, all of this led to just a slight amount of conflict within the areas of what would eventually be Germany, where Luther was operating. First, you had a massive peasant rebellion, where the average people of Germany said, well, if Luther's saying we're all equal before God, why aren't we equal in this world? And maybe we should not be serfs anymore and have rights. Luther did not support that, and the revolt was crushed. Different German princes started adhering to Luther's beliefs for different reasons. Some of them, I imagine, legitimately liked his religious teachings and the philosophy of Lutheranism, which Luther represented. Some of them wanted more power and didn't want to have to answer to the Pope or the Emperor, and so chose that path. And some of them probably figured that if they abandoned the Catholic Church, they could seize valuable church lands. And so what you started getting is brewing conflict between different German princes. And so what was worked out was something called the Peace of Augsburg, which in the 1550s said that each prince could choose their own religion and prevented a religious civil war for at least 100 years. And so, back to our starting objectives. Hopefully you can provide somewhat detailed answers to these questions, and we'll come back and do the prerequisite reading and discussion in class when I see you next.